Welcome to another episode of our Six Questions podcast. I'm Trent England with Save Our States, and I hope you've been enjoying our sort of best of six questions for the last couple of weeks. The Save Our States team has been out all around the country. We were in Denver and Atlanta and Las Vegas just for work. I promise you that, especially when it's 115 degrees out there, and in Dallas at conferences, meeting with grassroots activists and with legislators and legislative staff and other folks, sharing the information that we share all the time about the importance of the Electoral College, the danger of the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. Of course, all of that and all of the handouts that we use at all of those meetings are available at saveourstates.com. You can find all those resources there under our resources tab. So easy to find and download all of those materials. If you missed us at one of those conferences, all of that is there, as well as contact information. We'd love to partner with you to defend the Electoral College and the integrity of presidential elections. Today, I am excited to welcome to our Six Questions podcast, Curtis Shelton. I've known Curtis for a long time. Curtis is with the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs. He's a great podcast host in his own right of the Thinking on Lincoln podcast, which is actually not a podcast about Abraham Lincoln. We'll ask Curtis why it's called Thinking on Lincoln in a moment here. But he is a policy research fellow at the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs, does a lot of writing on economic policy in the state of Oklahoma. But he's a great, insightful thinker, and I'm very glad, Curtis, to welcome you to Six Questions.
Yeah, thanks, Trent. Glad to be here. It's exciting.
Yeah. So let's start off with your podcast. People should find Thinking on Lincoln wherever they stream their podcasts and subscribe and listen. Even though it's focused on Oklahoma, I think there's a lot there that would be interesting to folks wherever they are. But you co-host that with Ryan Haney, also of the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs. Tell us the idea behind the podcast and how you came to be a host of Thinking on Lincoln.
Yeah, I mean the general idea was basically to try to put out some maybe longer form content. A lot of what OCPA does is through the written form, basically either a quick social media post or longer form articles. I know anybody who's familiar with OCPA is certainly familiar with Ray Carter, who does a ton of journalism for us, but we thought reach a different audience with a different format. So the content's a little bit different than what we usually do. It's kind of a lot of interviews, and then Ryan and I, my co-host, it's kind of more philosophical in a sense. It's not so much rigorous, research or journalism. It's more kind of what you consider a podcast to be, kind of just a conversation between Ryan and I and whoever the guest is that we think has something to offer. It is generally focused on Oklahoma policy and politics, but we've had guests like Will Kane, Jason Whitlock on as well. So we do branch out every so often. The name came from, so OCPA is on Lincoln Boulevard, which happens to be the same street as the Capitol, which is on 23rd and Lincoln. We're just 10 blocks south. So that's where the name came from. We haven't yet had an Abraham Lincoln special, but we probably should, because I think just about everybody assumes the podcast is just some giant homage to Abraham Lincoln, which it hasn't been, but maybe it should. I don't know.
Yeah, sometimes people even in Oklahoma don't realize, 23rd and Lincoln is sort of shorthand for the state capitol, and as you said, OCPA is just 10 blocks south, also on Lincoln. So it's kind of an inside reference, but also makes a lot of sense. So Curtis, I want to ask you in just a minute how you're a relatively young guy. People are always talking about, we need more young people to be involved in politics, and people aren't paying attention. But I want to ask you a question that maybe leads into that. I'm not sure. And that's about school choice. One of OCPA's major agenda items is school choice. You see conservatives talking about this from coast to coast. West Virginia, Arizona have been at the forefront of expanding school choice. We've made some gains in Oklahoma as well. I actually think this is really important to the fight that I'm engaged in, protecting the Electoral College. But why is school choice so important, in general and in Oklahoma for OCPA?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think just about every facet of society kind of comes down to education. I know that might sound like a cliche a little bit. You hear that all the time about how important the kids are and how important the next generation is, but it's true. And I think a lot of that boils down to between the ages of, 5, 6 to 17, you spend more of your time at school than you do really anywhere else, especially if you're in sports. You're either with teachers or coaches basically your entire life up until you either graduate, go to college, or start your career in whatever field you feel like. So making sure that we provide a quality education is super important. And particularly in Oklahoma for the last, 2 or 3 decades, maybe longer. I'm only 27. So basically my entire lifetime, the standards probably haven't been quite what most people would want them to be. I think that's been admitted really by whether it's parents, administrators, teachers. I think everybody kind of understands that Oklahoma, in most respects, hasn't been up to par on academic performances. I know some people have issue with testing and things like that. But that's why school choice is so important, because it's clear that the system hasn't adequately prepared people for what it's supposed to be doing. And there are other options out there for parents, whether that's charter schools, private schools, homeschooling. The issue is there's a lot of barriers to that. And so school choice opens up a lot more options for parents and for students by basically giving them the option to not have to go to school based off of where they live, but based off of the needs that they have and them choosing the school that best meets those needs.
Yeah, makes sense to me. I mean, conservatives know that competition is how you get accountability, efficiency, and in the end, excellence. And it's been fascinating to me, having moved to Oklahoma just 8 years ago, that there's a lot of resistance to that based on the idea that, well, it's going to upset the apple cart for some of our school districts that are all chronically underperforming. I mean, it's amazing. You've done great work, exposing that you look at all these districts and, I mean, there are very few districts in the state that are performing anywhere near their own standards, and their own standards are probably pretty low. So Curtis, as you said, I mean, you're 27. You grew up in Oklahoma. You have wound up working for a conservative think tank in Oklahoma City. How did that happen? That's a very unusual thing for anybody your age to be engaged in politics, but to be engaged in public policy to that level, that's pretty amazing. I'm sure there's some parents out there who would like to know, how do you make sure that young people not only remain conservative, but actually get engaged in that way?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't know if my story is something that's super repeatable just because it was very fortuitous a little bit. I'll try to keep it relatively brief, but I think a lot of it started my sophomore year of college. One of my roommates, who's just a better person than I am, as evidenced by this story, for spring break, he planned a trip for all of us to go to Chicago, not to, hang out and see the sightseeing, but he had been in contact with a ministry out there who had been doing a lot of work on the south side of Chicago, just with that community. So we spent basically the entire week down there learning about what it is that they're doing. And it was basically, at the time, I don't know if it's grown since then, but it was this one guy and his family basically who decided to transplant his entire family. He had an older son and then 2 kids in elementary school to the south side of Chicago, just to understand what that community needed. And he thought the best way to understand what they need is to live with them and be in a community with them full time. So throughout that week, we learned about what they were doing, whether it was opening up a coffee shop to help those people find jobs and get job training, on the job training experience. Throughout that, they were providing childcare, whether that was through after school ministry programs or places for the kids to go after school to have somewhere to be safe and to have something fun to do as well. They were also doing a lot of homeless outreach. We visited a homeless shelter out there. And they did something that I thought was super unique. Each week, they would go out into the city with 2 sack lunches and go try to find someone who's living on the street and not just give them something, but ask if they can eat lunch with them. So it was really the whole weekend was about how can we really help these people. And the only way to know how to really help these people is to be in community with them. And throughout that week, it kind of opened my eyes about how, one, complicated it is to really help people who may be less fortunate than us. It's not so much just giving them things. That was one of the main takeaways that we got from the homeless shelter. We talked to so many people there who had been living in there and who now worked there. And they said the experience of getting to feel a value, to basically go through that process, to be given the homeless shelter met needs that they needed, but they also gave them an avenue to kind of reach beyond just their basic needs, right? It gave them an opportunity to maybe develop a skill and to use that skill, and how important that was to kind of regain some of that dignity. I'm sure a few people here know this, but one of the biggest factors about prolonged homelessness is that it creates this such an extreme anxiety that so many people who may have not had mental illness before they were homeless develop some sort of mental illness because of all the anxiety they're reaching. So that, again, makes the problem super complicated. And just kind of seeing all of that and seeing the various ways that they were helping kind of inspired me to think, I want to do something like this. I wasn't really sure. I was, still an idealistic college kid. Wasn't sure what I wanted to do. But that kind of set me on this path of doing something nonprofit related, something maybe poverty related. Fast forward a little bit to my senior year, I ended up basically pulling a Thomas book off the shelf of a friend's bookshelf. I don't think he had even read it yet, but it was Wealth, Poverty, and Politics, for those who were wondering. I was studying finance and economics at the time. I had a lot of off time my senior year. My second semester, I'd been planning on going to law school. I didn't have class Thursday, Fridays, so I was just reading a lot those days. And reading that book kind of showed me a way to apply what I wanted to do with what I was learning. So that had been a struggle for me, was how can I didn't want to do, investment stuff. I didn't want to do a ton of just basic economic research. I wanted to help people, but I didn't know how my skills can really help that. And reading that book showed me how important economics is to understanding not just what the problems are, but maybe some solutions to those problems. And not only the solutions, but looking at how some of our attempts at solving those problems really hurt. A lot of that book talked about community up until the 1950s, and then you saw that really taper off after the civil rights movement, which is something that I never heard about before. It was really eye-opening to see just how much government intervention, as well-intentioned as it might have been, hasn't seemed to provide the answer that they were looking for. And then lastly, so that kind of opened my eyes to, all right, I can actually do something to help people with an economics degree, not just be some number cruncher. And then I actually ended up talking to you and Jonathan after I graduated. I was touring OU Law, actually, and you all gave me a book, The Conservative Heart by Arthur Brooks. And that was really the last straw for what I wanted to do. One, it opened my eyes to what think tanks are. I didn't really know what a think tank was at the time. So just talking to you guys. And then reading that book showed, again, the importance of dignity for human beings and how work can be, it's not just a means to an end. It actually provides a way for human beings to feel valued and to provide the value for others, which is something that all of us, whether we understand it or not, need. And most of us do that through work. Obviously, it's not the only way. For anybody who's staying at home caring for their kids can find immense value in that as well, obviously. That's arguably more important than any job that we're going to do in our careers. But that was basically showed me, okay, this is an actual path I can do. Thankfully, you all gave me an internship after I visited with you all. And from there, we ended up here.
Yeah.
Sorry if that's a long explanation, but.
It's good. No, it's good. And I think there's a piece of that you prefaced it by saying you don't know how replicable it is. And obviously everyone's story is, in a certain sense, anecdotal, but I do think that idea of seeing how other people live and understanding human complexity in the context of trying to help people solve problems, right? I mean, this is where the left just utterly fails, because it's all about good intentions and sort of, I think in the politics on the left, it becomes about sort of quantifying good intentions, which oftentimes is about giving people stuff. And, and then, I mean, pushed a little farther. I mean, sometimes like in education, it seems like the people who are giving people stuff, when they get their way and they ratchet up education funding as far as they say they need to, and then they don't get the results they want, then they turn around and sort of blame the people they're providing it to. These families are no good. These kids are no good, or it just turns out that it always costs a little bit more. And I think the kind of practical experience that you described is the antidote to all of that, and it's just helping people understand how complex these problems are. One of the complex problems of the moment, in Oklahoma and more so in other states across the country is inflation. There's a lot of talk about how you address inflation with, people talking about cutting taxes, raising taxes, increasing government spending. Curtis, what do you make of all of that? And in particular, it looks like Congress is going to raise taxes, and there are people saying that that's a way to fight inflation because it's pulling money out of the economy. What's your answer to all that?
Yeah, I think the biggest frustration I've had with the inflation debate has been how authoritative people have been about saying this is exactly what's been causing inflation. When in reality, it's basically been all the things people have talked about, right? It's the pandemic suppressed demand to such a level that it was clearly not going to be sustained for long term. The supply chain issue clearly affected it during the pandemic and now afterwards. And then the government spending, like you talked about, all three of those factors have led to inflation. Whether it's the Biden administration trying to blame strictly supply chain, which is clearly wrong, or whether it's people on the right like us who sometimes try to maybe put too much weight on what the federal government has done, which it has done a lot to create inflation, but it's not the sole source. But yeah, and this, to get where basically what it feels like the government's doing is we've made a problem, and the only way to fix that is to kind of dig deeper in the hole, almost, is what it feels like to me. The insane spending, whether that was Trump with the CARES Act, the American Rescue Plan, basically gave people a bunch of money that they weren't spending. There was nowhere to go with that money. Obviously, some people needed assistance, right? People who maybe lost their jobs and couldn't make mortgage payments. I had no problem with the government providing for them because the reason they lost their jobs is because the government shut down their place of work, right? So if you tell people they can't work and then tell them they also aren't going to get anything to help pay their mortgages, feels like a bad thing. But to send it out to everybody, to have not only just sending checks to people, but inflating state governments, spend local governments as well. Just the massive influx of cash. Everybody said it was going to lead to inflation. It seemed like people kind of ignored that. And we're hopeful that once the pandemic ended, supply chains are going to crank back up and we're going to be fine. Obviously, it didn't happen. So now here we are, looking at maybe raising taxes, basically looking for government to, again, provide the solution. Like I talked about before, it's not always about just giving people things they need. If you really want to combat inflation, it's going to be hard. It's going to have to take long-term approaches, but obviously the Fed's going to do what they're going to do as far as trying to tamper back the economy, which isn't necessarily ideal. Obviously, people don't want recession to happen. But the only other way to really deal with the inflation problem is to increase productivity. And the best way to do that is actually through cutting taxes, not through increasing taxes, right? The more things cost, the less people buy.
Yeah.
And taxes invariably make things cost more, right? So if you're going to increase the cost of doing business for businesses, they're going to be doing less business, which is exactly what happened with the supply chain problem. You're going to be producing less goods and the demand's not going to go away.
Yeah.
So,
well, yeah. And government, they're not saying in DC that they want to raise taxes to take money out of the economy. They're saying they want to raise taxes and spend all that money back into the economy. So it seems like a strange claim to make that somehow, tax increases to fund spending programs would have some, systemic effect on inflation. You mentioned tax cuts. Talking here with Curtis Shelton on our 6 Questions podcast. This is question number 5, Curtis. There are, I think, 9 states that currently have no personal income tax. I know that OCPA is pushing for Oklahoma to become the 10th state. Why is that? Why is that important? What do you see going on in these other states? Obviously, I'm milking my 5th question for all I can get out of it. But Curtis Shelton, tax cuts in Oklahoma and around the country at the state level. What do you think?
Yeah, well, it's like I just got finished saying the best way to increase productivity is through tax cuts primarily, at least for the government side of things. I know a lot of people like to point to Kansas back in 2012 when they tried to implement some massive income tax as kind of the poster child for how it's going to go wrong. Interestingly enough, since that, I think 24 or 25 states have implemented some sort of income tax cut since then. So for all the damage Kansas seemed to have done to itself, nobody seemed to think that was a bad idea. 25 states have done it since. Last year, 10 states had some sort of income tax reduction. the reason the income tax is such a harmful tax is that it taxes work, it taxes productivity. Like I said, the more you tax something, the more it costs, the less people do it. It's usually not a good thing to have less people working. That usually tends to lead to a less productive economy. So to eliminate the income tax, research is kind of conclusive that it's going to spur the economy. The Tax Foundation just did kind of a meta-analysis on, it was double digit. I can't remember the number of papers. It was double digit papers. And I think all but one of them showed a positive effect on whether it was reducing the actual rate, making the income tax less progressive, and basically lowering the number of tax brackets. But really, any kind of income tax reform that we proposed has benefited the economy by and large. And anecdotally, you see it across the country: Florida, Texas, Tennessee, even Washington. All the states that don't have an income tax have, for the last 2 decades, really have been outgrowing not just high tax states, but all states. Obviously, high tax states have suffered the most. California, New York, Connecticut have seen huge amounts of wealth leave those states, and they primarily left to states like Florida, Texas, and others. And if Oklahoma wants to continue to compete, not only compete better with Texas, who is our primary economic competitor, but the rest of the states across the country, we're going to have to seriously look at some sort of income tax reform. For the last few years, we've been, advocating for really any kind of income tax. Happy with that. I'm starting to get nervous that because we had 10 states do a cut last year, there's a ton of momentum for a lot of states to get down to zero. So I think if Oklahoma waits too long, we might actually not see as much benefit out of it as we could if we're one of the early adopters. All the research is pretty clear. Giving people more control over their own money tends to be a better idea than letting government control the spending. Throughout history, we've seen that. We're seeing that right now. We just talked about all the inflation problems that have primarily exacerbated through government spending. So reducing income tax not only makes people more productive, it also limits government spending in a way that is really hard to do. Really, you have two options. You have to trust lawmakers to keep themselves in control, which is really not something that you can do, not for long term at least, or you can take away some of their revenue through tax cuts. So I think it's kind of a win-win for most taxpayers.
Yeah, I want to ask you a question, 5.1 about Kansas. I think I want to get your reaction to this, because I think part of what happened in Kansas, and I think this happens in other states sometimes when they cut taxes, especially with the income tax, that, Curtis, you're very smart. So, you made a couple of statements and you understand exactly what you mean. But I think sometimes when people hear we can cut the income tax and by doing that, we will spur economic growth, you get this other kind of claim, which can be true in extreme cases, which is we're going to cut income taxes, and because of economic growth, government will bring in just as much money as they would have before, which, if income taxes, when you've got rates that are like 70% or something crazy like that, like we actually have seen in past history, you take those rates down to 30%, and you've got the Laffer curve effect, but you get some either unscrupulous politicians on the right, or, dare I say it, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt and just say really ignorant politicians on the right. It's always nice. It sounds worse, but it's always nicer to accuse politicians of just not knowing what they're talking about. Who say, "Oh no, we're going to cut income taxes and we're going to bring in more money." And I mean, is that what happened in Kansas? They just overpromised and then walked into a fiscal disaster. Do I have that?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. I think it's like you mentioned the Laffer curve. I think it's just a misunderstanding of the Laffer curve. Small economic lesson for those who may not understand. It's basically a back of the napkin, theory on what happens when you cut taxes, right? On one hand, you have a 0% tax rate, you're bringing in no money. On the other end, you have a 100% tax rate, meaning no one's going to work because they're not going to make any money. And then you have this big curve, right? Which in theory shows that if you cut taxes, you're actually going to get more money, which is what you mentioned. It's just, that's in all reality, that's not how it actually works. What usually happens when you cut taxes, you do have economic growth, but it's not going to be enough growth to overcome all the lost government revenue through the tax cut. It may, over a long stretch, eventually you may get there, 10, 20 years down the road. But Kansas kind of assumed, in year 1, 2, and 3, we're going to have even more revenue than we did before. They had, I know, I don't want to get in the weeds too much. They had some education funding issues as well, where they were have to crank up their spending anyways. Plus, they were kind of banking on more revenue. So the spending was way out of touch with what they actually brought in revenue based off of some pretty flawed assumptions about what would happen. They also had some poorly designed income tax. I don't want to misconstrue the details too much, but basically the way they treated pass-through corporations wasn't an ideal approach. To where they're basically favoring one corporate structure over another, which you never want to do with the tax code. You never want to favor one thing over another if you can help it. So there's a lot of flaws with what Kansas did, primarily, like you mentioned. Assuming tax cuts lead to enough growth to overcome the revenue losses is usually not a good way to go about it. A better way to think about it is a lot of people who are critics of tax cuts say it's going to bleed the state dry. In reality, you're going to see enough growth to make those losses less drastic than the critics may point to, but you're most likely, unless you have a crazy tax rate, like perhaps California may see something like that. Well, I say that, I doubt it, because they just have such a big state budget, but you'd have to have an incredibly high tax rate to actually see kind of the laugh curve effect take effect.
Yeah. These politicians talk about it like it's, in some cases, in the case of Kansas, like it's the laugher line rather than the laugher curve, right? Like if it's a curve, then like you can be on the side where you cut taxes and get more revenue, but you can also be on the side where you cut taxes and get less revenue. I mean, that's the nature of it being a curve. So I don't, again, I think some of these politicians just don't. They hear what they want to hear, and then they repeat that, and then they get into trouble.
I think you hear the words economic growth, and you just assume, like the economy grew, so the state government should grow as well. And it's like that's not quite how it works. But
so, talking with Curtis Shelton here on our 6 Questions podcast, he is a policy research fellow at the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs and the co-host of Thinking on Lincoln, a podcast about politics and public policy in the great state of Oklahoma. Not about Lincoln. It's just the state capital's on Lincoln. So you can find Thinking on Lincoln, subscribe, listen, share. It's a great podcast. A lot of interesting guests on there. So Curtis, our last question on 6 Questions is always, who is your favorite founding father and why?
Yeah. I don't know if this disappoints some people, but it won't be Lincoln. He was a great president. I read one of his biographies actually about a year or 2 ago. Super enjoyable, but this is boring, but I'm going to say Washington. Again, this is based off of maybe how much information I know about the different presidents, but his kind of rise to where he ended up, I think, is one of the most interesting. I don't know if a lot of people know that he got a ton of his wealth because a lot of his relatives died, right? A lot of kind of his early maybe prosperity was through a lot of tragedy, which I think shaped him in a way that I think is super interesting. And also kind of made him at least a little bit more aware of his place in the world that not a lot of our other maybe more ambitious founding fathers had. Maybe some of them did. Hamilton obviously saw a lot of that as well. And I also think the enduring legacy of a man at a time who stepped away from power when no one else would even consider that. I mean, you're seeing that even nowadays with all sorts of different leaders in various countries who seem to not want to go away. And we think we've progressed so far and we're so more morally superior than the people in the past. But this is a man who came from a culture of kings, right? Who lived their entire lives and then their sons would take over after them. And he walked away from it, basically as the most popular president we've ever had. And I think a lot of us, we celebrate that every year, right? Every time we have a new president come in, we kind of celebrate Washington's legacy in effect, but I don't think we really understand what that actually meant at the time to see somebody step away from how much power and how much control he had. Feels to me like kind of it was just bigger than him. I don't think he even really understood the impact it was going to have. I mean, I know he did to a degree, but I don't think he could have really seen this far in advance. And I think his legacies kind of speak for themselves in that. And it's hard for me to maybe put someone above him.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense to me. Washington was the indispensable man. I mean, no one founding a republic wasn't just about all the words that they wrote. I think, sometimes we focus so much on the Constitution, and I love the Federalist Papers and all those things, but ultimately the actions really do speak louder than words, and it took the actions of a man like Washington to bring all that into effect. So
yeah,
makes sense to me.
Yeah, it is interesting too, seeing a man who really had no formal education at all, leading people like Jefferson, Hamilton, Adams, Madison, who these intellectual giants, and here's Washington, who basically self-taught in every way, is their superior basically in every way you can imagine for the most part. So,
Curtis Shelton of the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs and the Think on Lincoln podcast. Thanks so much for being a part of Six Questions.
Thanks, Trent.
And thanks to all of you for watching and listening. Remember, you can subscribe to this podcast in any place that podcasts are commonly available. Please share it on social media. Please go to our website, saveourstates.com. The power of what we do to defend the Electoral College and the integrity of our system of federalism, our presidential elections, is just the power of all the people who are connected with us, who find our resources, learn about the best ways to defend the Electoral College, whether that's by sharing information with the young people around you, whether that's by reaching out and contacting your state legislators. Certainly be paying attention as we move toward the election in November. We're going to have a lot of brand new state legislators. They will need to hear from you. We'll talk about that on future episodes, and certainly on our Save Our State social media pages. So please be connected with us there as well. I'm Trent England. Thanks for watching.